when a young man slowly blinked open his eyes in the hospital ward, murmuring about a sinister conspiracy that nearly killed him and defrauded his entire family. The doctors at first attributed it to delirium. But then he mentioned one detail so precise, so eerie, that it shattered their initial disbelief and launched a whirlwind of questions that would shake even the most skeptical among them. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of truth, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Chris Parker had no idea how long he had been unconscious. He only knew that his throat burned when he tried to speak and that each breath felt like someone had placed a weight on his chest. The first thing he remembered was the echo of a dull thud, a jolt of terror, and then darkness. In the hospital bed, he blinked under harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to drill straight through his skull. The nurse at his bedside, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, gasped when she saw his lips moving. For weeks, the staff had been treating him as just another coma patient with an uncertain prognosis. Now, here he was, stirring back to life. The nurse rushed to his side, calling his name. At first, Chris could only form ragged whispers. But when those whispers turned into fragmented accusations, "Someone pushed me, I saw a hand on my back, my uncle is behind this," a chill spread through the ward. He tried to speak faster than his raw throat allowed, gasping out claims about a treacherous plot, about missing parents, about a grand estate that used to be his home. The words tumbled together, half mad and urgent, yet there was something in the depth of his gaze that made the nurse realize these were not mere fevered fantasies. Under a swirl of confusion, Chris Parker's stay in the hospital shifted from routine recovery to something more akin to an unfolding mystery. As the days passed, doctors and staff recognized that his injuries did not fully align with a simple accident. He had extensive bruises on his arms and torso, consistent with a violent struggle or deliberate force. Yet the official story in the hospital's paperwork stated that he had fallen down the grand staircase in his family's home. Details were conflicting, and the man who had arranged his care, his uncle, Richard Vance, was nowhere to be found after leaving vague contact information. Chris, for his part, found himself caught between relief at being alive and the gnawing suspicion that the same people who put him here might try to finish the job. He spent his first conscious week struggling to connect the threads of memory, as though his mind were a mosaic of broken shards. A good portion of that time blurred with intravenous drips, blinking monitors, and the hushed footsteps of nurses doing their rounds. But bit by bit, Chris managed to recall more. He remembered that his parents had disappeared years ago, leaving him under the care of his uncle, an arrangement that never felt quite right. He remembered the sprawling Parker estate, with its marble floors and cavernous hallways. He remembered waking up one morning determined to look into his parents' finances, suspecting that something about their disappearance was more than just an unsolved tragedy. And then he remembered the chill of a hand on his shoulder, a fierce shove, and the sensation of falling. Chris tried to relay these recollections to the hospital staff. Some believed him. Others gently suggested that perhaps he was mixing nightmares with reality. Despite their professional caution, a rumor began circulating among them. The patient in room 416 might be the victim of something far more sinister than a random tumble down the stairs. More than once, Chris woke from restless sleep to find a nurse or orderly hovering as though they wanted to ask him about the bizarre things he muttered in the throes of his nightmares. He was grateful for their concern but also felt a suffocating fear that time was slipping away, and that his uncle or someone else might reappear at any moment to silence him for good. On the 10th day after Chris regained consciousness, a stranger walked into his room. He was a lean, middle-aged man with a worn suit and an air of subdued intensity. He introduced himself as Detective Daniel Lawson, flashing a badge with measured calm. "It's good to see you awake," Lawson said quietly, pulling a chair to the bedside. "I've been curious about what happened the night you were brought in." Chris swallowed, mindful that his voice was still rasping. "Who sent you?" Lawson hesitated. I heard rumors from one of the staff. And there's an old missing persons case involving your parents that crossed my desk years ago, a case that never sat right with me. Chris studied him, unsure whether to trust this detective or dismiss him as another possible threat. My uncle, he started, trailing off as a wave of terror fluttered in his chest. He pictured Richard's cold expression in some half-recalled confrontation. I think my uncle wanted me out of the picture. Lawson listened carefully, occasionally making note. He seemed neither surprised nor doubtful, just intent. I ran your name through some records, he said. The estate you mention, your family's estate, used to belong to your father, Walter Parker, and your mother, Marie. They vanished about 4 years ago. No bodies, no official leads. He tapped the pen against his palm. You're the legal heir, but your uncle, Richard Vance, has been in control of everything, as far as I can tell. If your accident wasn't an accident, that's huge. We need something concrete. Witness statements, physical evidence, anything that connects him to wrongdoing. Chris closed his eyes, feeling a dull ache behind them. There has to be proof, he whispered. My father was investigating something. I don't remember what, but it was serious enough that he kept telling me never to trust everyone in our family's circle. He said corruption ran deep. Then, the memory flickered out, leaving him with only jagged uncertainty. He stared at Lawson, half pleading. I can't prove it from a hospital bed. Then let's make sure you get well enough, Lawson replied. I'll keep my ears open, and if you recall specifics, you let me know. In the meantime, stay alert. If someone did push you, they may not be done trying to cover their tracks. That conversation lingered in Chris's mind, fueling him with a sense of urgency to regain his strength. Physical therapy became a crucible for him. Every painful step, every tentative stretch, brought him closer to the day he would walk out of the hospital and seek answers for himself. His injuries were extensive: cracked ribs, a concussion, and a hairline fracture in his leg, but he showed surprising resilience. Nurses whispered that it was sheer force of will keeping him on his feet. He would grit his teeth, push past the pain, and remind himself that once he left, he could finally discover what truly happened the night he fell. Days turned into weeks, and Chris's memories continued to form patchy mosaics of what life had been like in the Parker estate. He recalled an imposing library with walls of mahogany shelving. He pictured a family crest embroidered on the rug, the Parker name spelled out in gold thread. He saw illusions of half-familiar faces at grand dinners, fleeting glimpses of tension between his parents and Richard, who always seemed to be whispering with associates in dimly lit corners. Chris cursed his mind's sluggishness, wishing he could pin down the exact detail that would condemn his uncle. He needed more than half-remembered feelings. He needed something conclusive, like financial statements or a caretaker's testimony, anything that showed Richard's motive. He also wondered about his parents. The official story was that they had traveled overseas and vanished, presumably victims of an accident or foul play in some distant part of the world. But Chris, even in his state of partial amnesia, sensed that was a lie. They would never have left him behind unless something extreme forced them to. Sometimes, in the solitude of his hospital room late at night, he would recall a moment from his childhood. His father laughing as they tossed a baseball outside, or his mother reading bedtime stories in a gentle, lilting voice, and he would be overwhelmed by a surge of grief. If they were alive, would they have reached out by now? Or had Richard orchestrated their disappearance? Detective Lawson returned for more conversations, each time asking if Chris recalled new details. One evening, the detective arrived looking haggard, his tie askew, dark circles under his eyes. Thought you'd want to know, he told Chris quietly. Your uncle made a sizable donation to the hospital last month. He called it a philanthropic gesture. I find the timing interesting. Chris stiffened. What if he's bribing them to keep quiet? Lawson shrugged. I don't have proof of that. But it's suspicious. Also, I checked the official statements about your accident. All the staff documented was a phone call from an unidentified man who claimed you fell down the stairs. No one's name is on those forms, and your uncle hasn't responded to calls. If this was on the level, why so mysterious? Chris felt his pulse quicken. Perhaps Richard was trying to ensure that the hospital wouldn't question the circumstances of his injuries. The detective promised to keep investigating. Chris, for his part, felt restless, convinced that if he didn't act soon, critical evidence might vanish. He refused sedatives at night, determined to keep a clear head in case any suspicious staff members decided to meddle with his medication or slip something into his chart. More than once, he caught glimpses of a man in hospital scrubs standing in the hallway, watching him from a distance before scuttling away. Was it paranoia, or was he truly being monitored? Eventually, the doctors declared Chris well enough to be discharged. He still needed crutches and frequent checkups, but he was no longer in critical condition. On the day he left, an anxious murmur followed him through the corridors. Some nurses offered warm smiles and well wishes, but Chris sensed an undercurrent of unease among them. He wondered if a few staff members had overheard enough to realize their patient might be stepping right back into danger. He thanked them anyway, aware that showing gratitude was the least he could do for those who believed him. Detective Lawson arrived in a battered sedan to drive him to a safe location, explaining that it might be unwise for Chris to return immediately to the Parker estate. "Just until we figure out how deep this goes," Lawson insisted. Chris felt a pang at the idea of being a guest in a protective environment, but he knew the detective was right. If Richard had indeed pushed him, or arranged for it, the Parker estate was the last place he needed to be lurking around unprepared. They drove through the city, a place Chris barely recognized after so many weeks in the hospital. At one point, he lowered the window to breathe in the outside air, scanning the sidewalks and passing cars for any sign of a tail. Paranoia lingered in the back of his mind, telling him that any passing stranger could be an agent of his uncle. Lawson noticed his tension. "We can't hide forever, but we can be cautious," he said. Chris nodded, forcing a half-smile. "I appreciate that. But I do want to go back to the estate eventually. There has to be evidence there, maybe files or diaries my father kept." Lawson raised an eyebrow. "It's possible. Just promise me you'll let me come with you. If your uncle is as dangerous as you suspect, I don't want you stumbling into something alone." At a modest rental house on the quieter outskirts of town, Lawson helped Chris settle in. "Consider this a safe house," Lawson told him. "One of my friends who's out of state owns it. You'll be off the grid here." Chris hobbled inside, noting the worn furniture and sparse decor. It was a far cry from the lavish style of his family's estate, but he felt an odd relief that it was humble and unremarkable. Maybe that meant Richard wouldn't think to look for him here. Chris began a new routine of quiet recovery. Days were spent doing physical therapy exercises at home. Detective Lawson dropped by regularly, bringing groceries, checking on him, and sometimes dropping cryptic hints about his own investigations. From time to time, Lawson mentioned that he'd discovered suspicious financial transactions linking Richard Vance to a few shell companies. But nothing directly tied Vance to Chris's fall yet. "He's slippery," Lawson would mutter. "We need a direct link, someone who saw him give the order, or a paper trail with his signature on it." Late one afternoon, while Chris was stretching on the couch, a call came through on his newly acquired phone. A woman's voice, nervous and trembling, introduced herself as Helen, a former maid at the Parker estate. "I heard from a friend that you're awake," she said quickly, breath hitching. I don't want to talk long. Mr. Vance fired me a few months back, but I saw things. I know your accident wasn't what he claimed." Chris's heart hammered. "Tell me," he urged. Helen hesitated. "I can't do it over the phone. I'm too afraid they'll trace the call. But I'll meet you somewhere public. Tomorrow. I'll text you the location." Before he could press her for details, she hung up. The next day, Chris shared this news with Lawson, who insisted on accompanying him. Though Chris's leg was still healing, he managed to move with a cane now, leaving the crutches behind. They arrived at a busy downtown cafe, a place bustling enough to prevent any easy ambush. Chris spotted a woman in her early 50s, her hair pinned back, glancing around nervously. She jerked upright when she recognized him. Lawson hung back, letting Chris approach first. "Helen?" Chris asked quietly. She nodded, eyes darting like a cornered animal's. They took seats at a small table. "Thank you for meeting me," Chris said. "I know this isn't easy." Helen swallowed hard. "I don't know who else to tell. I was the maid who cleaned up your blood on the stairs that night," she whispered, voice trembling. "Mr. Vance called me in a panic, told me to make it spotless before the paramedics arrived. Said you'd fallen and it was a tragedy, but his manner, it was terrifying. And it wasn't just your blood I found. There were signs of a struggle, broken bits of the railing, scuff marks that looked like you tried to hold on. None of that was in the official report." Chris felt a rush of nausea. He had faint recollections of gripping the banister as he tumbled, desperately trying to save himself. "So you believe he pushed me?" Helen nodded, tears glistening. "I do. And I think he's been lying about your parents too. I overheard arguments between him and your father before your parents disappeared. Money. Business deals that didn't add up. The night they vanished, Mr. Vance was raging that your father had discovered some corruption. Then your parents were just gone. He told the staff they'd traveled, but I don't think that was true." A burning sensation coiled in Chris's chest. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Helen twisted a napkin in her trembling fingers. "He fired me and threatened me. Said if I ever talked, I'd regret it. I was too scared. But after I heard you were alive, I figured it might be my only chance to come clean." Lawson, who had discreetly joined them, placed a comforting hand on Helen's shoulder. "If you're willing to give a statement, we can protect you." Helen bit her lip. "Protect me how? These people have power. They can make someone vanish easily." Lawson hesitated, knowing the limits of his resources. "We'll do what we can. If you have anything, documents, messages, anything that links him to wrongdoing, it would help." Helen's face fell. "I only have my word. But I remember one time your father gave me a stack of sealed envelopes, told me to lock them in the guesthouse safe. He said if something happened to him, I should make sure his son got them. Mr. Vance discovered them a week later and demanded I hand them over. I never got the chance to see what was inside. Despite the disappointment, it was still a clue. There had been documents that Walter Parker wanted Chris to have. Perhaps there were duplicates somewhere, or perhaps they still existed, hidden away in the estate." Chris exchanged a look with Lawson, who gave a near imperceptible nod. They both knew that sooner or later, they would have to return to that house and search every inch. Days later, Lawson called Chris with unexpected news. "Richard Vance is back in town. I heard from a contact that he's hosting a lavish charity gala at the Parker estate. People are talking about it, some bigwigs will be there. Might be your chance to slip in unnoticed if you're careful." Chris's heart raced. The idea of confronting his uncle under a roof that might still hold evidence was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. Yet he saw the opportunity. "I can't exactly waltz in with an invitation," he pointed out. Lawson sighed. "We'll figure out a way. Maybe I can pass you off as a +1 for a friend. But you'll need to be discreet." That night, as Chris lay in bed, he mulled over the plan. He imagined himself navigating the estate's corridors, scanning for hidden compartments or locked rooms that might hold a file, a diary, or something else his father left behind. If only his body were stronger. Each step still brought twinges of pain, but he refused to let that deter him. The next morning, he told Lawson he was in. Lawson, in turn, arranged for a small infiltration team, other trustworthy contacts in law enforcement who could blend into the gala crowd. "Don't ask me for official sanction," Lawson warned Chris. "This is off the books. If things go south, you'll have to get out on your own." Chris steeled himself. "I've come this far. I won't back down now. They spent the next few days gathering everything they might need for the infiltration. Lawson's friends pulled strings to secure formal wear and invitations, forging them carefully to avoid detection. Chris practiced walking without his cane, determined not to appear vulnerable in front of Richard or any of his associates. Inside, though, his anxiety ran high. Who else might be at the gala? Were they the same people who had conspired with Richard to defraud his family? On the evening of the event, Chris donned a tailored suit that felt foreign on his still-healing body. Standing in front of a mirror, he hardly recognized himself. The reflection stared back with a grim determination in the eyes. "You can do this," he whispered, tasting the bitterness of doubt. Moments later, Lawson drove them in a borrowed car, a sleek black sedan that would blend in among the wealthier crowd. The estate came into view, its gates wide open, illuminated by ornate lamps that showcased the grand driveway. For a moment, Chris felt an overwhelming nostalgia. The Parker estate had been his childhood home, a place he once loved. Now it felt more like a mausoleum for secrets and lies. They handed their invitations to a wary-looking valet, who barely glanced at them before waving them in. Music drifted from inside, a string quartet's gentle notes that belied the tension Chris felt. The foyer was a swirl of elegantly dressed guests, waiters weaving between them with trays of champagne. Through the crowd, Chris glimpsed Richard Vance, standing near a marble statue and speaking with an older gentleman. Richard exuded composure, wearing an expensive suit that matched his polished grin. Chris felt his stomach churn at the sight of the man who, in his fractured memories, had shoved him down the stairs. He forced himself to stay calm, recalling the plan. Slip away, search the upstairs studies and private rooms, gather any evidence, and get out. Lawson discreetly separated from Chris, mingling among the guests to keep watch. Chris made his way toward a corridor that led deeper into the house, behind closed doors. He paused at a roped-off area, scanning for security. 2 guards stood there, looking bored. Chris slipped behind a column, waiting for a distraction. As if on cue, one of Lawson's friends faked a fainting spell nearby, exclaiming dramatically about the heat. The guards rushed forward to help, leaving the path unprotected. Chris seized the moment, ducking under the rope and vanishing into the unlit corridor beyond. He felt his heart pounding against his ribs, the hush of the hallway so stark after the noisy gala. Memories flickered. The pattern of the carpet, the shape of the chandeliers overhead. He remembered as a child running through these halls, playing hide-and-seek. Now he was a trespasser in his own home, searching for the truth. Slowly, carefully, he made his way upstairs, heading for the library, a place his father had often retreated to when dealing with important matters. The door was locked, but he found a hairpin in his pocket. Lawson had suggested carrying it for just such a lock, and fumbled with it until the latch clicked. Inside, the library was dark, save for moonlight filtering through tall windows. Dust motes danced in the beams. He flicked on a small flashlight he had concealed inside his jacket. Rows of books greeted him. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. He moved to the heavy wooden desk at the far end, pulling open drawers that had once been stuffed with his father's note. They were largely empty now, just a few blank papers and old fountain pens. Had Richard cleared everything out? A wave of frustration and despair crept in. But he didn't give up. He tried pressing on the edges of the drawers, recalling that sometimes his father hid compartments behind false panels. Sure enough, one drawer gave a soft click. Behind it lay a concealed space containing a thin notebook, pages wrinkled and yellowed. Chris's pulse quickened as he opened it. His father's handwriting filled the lines, referencing suspicious business dealings, the names of associates, sums of money that didn't match official accounts. And there, scribbled near the end, was a note. If something happens to us, contact Detective Mooney or any honest officer. This runs deep, but I trust the law. Chris felt tears prick his eyes. His father hadn't given up hope that justice could prevail. He carefully placed the notebook into his jacket. A noise from the corridor made him freeze, a shuffle of footsteps. Quickly, He clicked off the flashlight, pressing himself against the wall. The library door opened a crack, a flashlight beam slicing across the floor. Chris held his breath. A guard? Or was it Richard himself? The beam passed over the desk, lingered for a moment, then withdrew. The door shut again. Chris exhaled slowly. He needed to get out before they locked down the house. Stealthily, he slipped back into the hallway. He still wanted to check the master suite, remembering that was where his parents slept. Perhaps there was another hidden stash. But as he approached that area, voices drifted up from the stairwell. He recognized his uncle's distinct tone, cool and clipped. Panicking, Chris ducked into a side alcove behind a large drapery. Richard's footsteps echoed. "Don't worry," he was saying to someone. "The boy's not going to show up. The doctors said he was still in no condition to walk, and even if he did, we have ways of dealing with him." Chris's hands balled into fists, anger surging. Here was confirmation, at least, that Richard saw him as a threat. Richard continued, "I've already directed funds to keep certain hospital staff quiet. By the time anyone tries to reopen the investigation, all they'll find is a stale missing persons case." Then he laughed softly. The footsteps receded. Chris let out a trembling breath, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it would give him away. He realized more than ever that the man was deeply entrenched in corruption, and this wasn't just about controlling the Parker estate. There could be an entire network of shady figures enabling him. Chris spent another hour prowling the upstairs hallways, searching in vain for additional hidden compartments. Finally, he decided he had enough for one night. The notebook in his jacket might contain the evidence needed to reopen his parents' case, and it was too risky to linger. He retraced his steps, creeping down to the first floor. At one point, he heard raised voices from the foyer, an argument of some sort, possibly Lawson confronting a guard. Chris took that as his cue to hurry. By the time he slipped out a side door, weaving through the estate's manicured gardens, he felt a surge of relief. He found the gate unlatched, which was either a stroke of luck or a sign that Lawson's infiltration team had meddled. Once on the road, he kept his head low until Lawson's borrowed sedan pulled up. Chris climbed in, adrenaline wearing off, exhaustion hitting him like a wave. "Did you get anything?" Lawson asked, scanning Chris's face. Chris patted his jacket. "A notebook. My father's notes on suspicious dealings. Names, numbers, references to hush money. That's more evidence than we've ever had." Lawson allowed a flicker of satisfaction to cross his features. "Good. We'll analyze it, compare it with the financial transactions I found. This could be enough to bring Richard in for questioning." Chris felt a tangle of dread and elation at the thought. "He was talking about me, you know. About ways to handle me. This is real, Lawson. He's not going to stop until I'm out of the picture." Lawson nodded solemnly. "Then we don't stop either. We push forward. I'll reach out to a few trusted people at the station, see if we can secure a warrant before he has a chance to bury more evidence." In the safe house, Chris pored over the notebook for hours. Some entries were cryptic, mentioning code names or transactions abroad. But others directly named Richard Vance, linking him to funds that vanished from the Parker family accounts shortly before Chris's parents disappeared. There was also mention of a mysterious associate identified only by initials, GK. Could that be someone who worked with Richard to orchestrate the parents' disappearance? Chris underlined that section, determined to investigate further. Lawson returned in the morning, coffee in hand, looking grim. "Bad news," he said. "Richard has a lot of sway. I can't get a straightforward warrant without providing more conclusive evidence. The higher-ups keep delaying. The best we can do is present what we have to the district attorney, but that could take weeks, and I'm not sure how far Richard's influence goes." Chris's shoulders slumped. "So what do we do?" Lawson hesitated. "We could go public, leak the notebook to the media. But that might tip him off and send him underground, or worse, prompt him to strike at you harder." Chris rubbed his temples. What about building a rock-solid case first? Maybe we can find more witnesses. Over the next few weeks, they launched a quiet campaign to track down former staffers, business partners, anyone who might have insight into Richard's dealings. Some were too fearful to talk. Others demanded anonymity. A few corroborated details from Walter Parker's notebook, describing secret meetings and sudden changes in estate finances. One caretaker even recalled loud altercations between Richard and Chris's father a few days before the parents vanished. All of this fueled the sense that they were on the brink of exposing a major crime. Yet the more progress they made, the more Chris felt a sense of creeping danger. And that danger soon became tangible. One night, as Chris was alone in the safe house, Lawson having stepped out to speak with a contact, someone tried the doorknob. Chris froze, adrenaline spiking. The knob jiggled again, then went still. Looking through the peephole, Chris glimpsed a figure in dark clothing slipping around the side of the house. Heart hammering, he dialed Lawson's number, but there was no immediate answer. A window rattled. Terrified, Chris remembered that Lawson kept a spare revolver under the couch, just in case. He limped to retrieve it. The window's glass cracked, a hand forcing it open from the outside. Chris raised the gun with shaking hands. "Get away!" he shouted. The intruder paused, then bolted. By the time Lawson arrived with sirens blaring behind him, the prowler was gone. But the point was made. Chris was a target. The safe house wasn't so safe anymore. Lawson had no choice but to relocate Chris to a small motel on the outskirts of a neighboring county, checking him in under a false name. Chris felt exhausted, anxious, and furious all at once. "How long do I have to keep hiding?" he demanded. Lawson sighed. "Until we can serve a proper warrant on Richard Vance. But I promise we're close. The district attorney's office is looking at the evidence. It's a matter of time." Time felt like a luxury Chris could not afford. For all he knew, Richard was busy destroying any last traces of proof about the parents' fate or forging an alibi to dismiss the notebook's contents as a forgery. Frustration boiled. Chris wanted to do more, to corner Richard himself. Lawson insisted that would be reckless. "Your father wrote in his notes that this conspiracy extended beyond just your uncle. If you confront him alone, you might end up disappearing like your parents." Reluctantly, Chris conceded that the detective was right. But he couldn't shake the feeling that a final collision was inevitable. At last, a breakthrough arrived in the form of a phone call from the district attorney's office. They had found enough credible evidence, between the notebook, the statements from ex-staff, and Richard's suspicious transactions, to authorize a search warrant for the Parker estate and to bring Richard in for questioning. Lawson practically raced to the motel to deliver the news. "We move tonight," he told Chris. "We have a team ready to search the house. We want you to come along to identify any hidden rooms or compartments, but you'll stay behind the lines. Understand?" Chris nodded, a blend of relief and trepidation swirling in his stomach. That evening, under a sky heavy with storm clouds, a convoy of unmarked police vehicles rolled onto the Parker estate. Chris rode with Lawson, scanning the grounds nervously. He felt a twinge of grief for the home that once symbolized his family's heritage. Now it was just a crime scene in the making. Uniformed officers approached the main door, search warrant in hand. Security guards on the premises froze in confusion, clearly not expecting an official raid. The tension was palpable. Chris stayed near the rear of the group, wanting to see Richard's reaction but also mindful of Lawson's warning. When the door was forced open, they found the front hall deserted, lights low. Thunder rumbled in the distance, flickering lightning illuminating the grand marble floors. The police fanned out, combing every wing. Chris's heart pounded every time he passed a familiar painting or piece of furniture, overshadowed by the knowledge that the man who tried to kill him was likely lurking somewhere inside these walls. They searched room after room without finding Richard. The master suite empty. The library, the same desk Chris had already rifled through. Officers bagged documents, computers, anything that might be relevant. Chris thought about the caretaker's mention of an old safe in the guest house. He nudged Lawson, and they led a small group outside to a smaller building adjacent to the main estate. Rain had started to fall, pattering against the cobblestones. The guest house was locked, but an officer kicked the door in. Inside, the musty smell of disuse washed over them. Furniture draped in sheets. A single overhead bulb flickered. They found a bolted safe in the corner, hidden behind a large cabinet. An officer carefully cracked it open, discovering more ledgers and older diaries, apparently belonging to Chris's parents. The diaries, upon a quick skim, hinted at even deeper corruption, lists of names, possibly local officials in Richard's pocket. Chris felt a surge of vindication. At the same time, he worried about what might happen if these diaries confirmed that his parents had been murdered. That sorrow pressed against his chest, but he tried to keep it at bay, focusing on the goal of justice. A crackle on the police radio pulled them back to the main house. Someone had spotted Richard Vance in the second-floor corridor. Chris's pulse lurched. He followed Lawson's group, trying to remain calm. Thunder boomed overhead as they hurried through the estate's halls. At the far end of an ornate hallway, they saw Richard standing near a large window, his silhouette lit by flickering lightning. Chris realized with a jolt that this was the same corridor leading to the top of the staircase where he had supposedly fallen. Officers shouted at Richard to surrender. He held up a revolver, his expression twisted with fury and desperation. "Get back," he snarled. Some of the officers took cover around the corner, aiming their weapons. Chris stayed behind them, but he could see his uncle's eyes darting wildly. "This is my house," Richard hissed. "You have no right to invade it. I built this empire, and no upstart nephew is taking it from me." Lawson, unarmed at that moment, raised his voice from behind cover. "Richard Vance, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with fraud, attempted murder, and more." "Drop the weapon." Richard let out a harsh laugh. "Is that so? I'm sure your precious evidence is all made up. You want me in prison while my nephew claims everything? Not a chance." Then Richard's gaze flicked to Chris, who was partially visible behind an officer. Recognition and hatred flared in his eyes. "So you crawled out of your hospital bed after all, Chris. You never did know when to quit." Chris felt his stomach churn. Despite the fear, he refused to back down. "I know what you did," Chris said, voice trembling with anger. "I remember the push, and I know you've been siphoning money, working with criminals. You killed my parents, didn't you?" A flash of something, guilt, rage, passed over Richard's face. Thunder rumbled again, shaking the windows. Officers barked for him to drop the weapon. Instead, Richard pointed the revolver at Chris, eyes glinting with malice. "I told them you were a loose end," he growled. "If only I'd made sure the fall ended you. But I can fix that now." Chris's heart hammered. The barrel seemed to fill his vision. One officer was about to fire, but Richard snarled, "Do that and the boy dies first." A hush stretched, broken only by the drip of rain from a nearby window. Then a voice from the far side of the corridor spoke calmly. "It's over, Richard." Detective Lawson emerged from the shadows, his own gun raised, aimed at Richard's chest. In the dim light, Chris could see the steely resolve etched on Lawson's face. "Drop it," Lawson said, voice unwavering. For a moment it seemed like Richard might try to shoot anyway. His hand trembled on the gun, flicking between Chris and the officers. Then, as if something in him cracked, he let out a shaky breath and dropped the revolver to the floor. Officers rushed forward, tackling him, forcing his arms behind his back. Chris sagged against the wall, relief crashing through him like a wave. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the entire scene. Richard pinned down, cursing, while uniformed officers read him his rights. Lawson stood to one side, weapon still drawn, breathing heavily. They handcuffed Richard, hauling him to his feet. He leveled a look of pure hatred at Chris. "You'll regret this," he spat, as the officers began to drag him away. Chris said nothing, his heart too full of conflicting emotions, triumph, fear, sorrow, exhaustion. Once Richard was gone, Lawson exhaled, then turned to Chris. "You okay?" Chris nodded mutely, trembling as he took in the corridor, the place where he had nearly lost his life. "Yeah," he managed, "thanks to you." The aftermath was a blur of official procedures. Officers took statements, combed the entire estate for more evidence, and arranged for Richard to be transported to a holding facility. The diaries, ledgers, and notebooks were all bagged and labeled, forming the backbone of a case that would soon reel in not just Richard, but potentially others who had conspired with him. Chris, physically and emotionally spent, found a quiet corner to sit, head in hand. Lawson joined him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "He's in custody now," Lawson said gently. "And with all of this evidence, there's no way he slips through the cracks." Chris nodded, tears threatening to break free. "I can't believe it's over. Or starting to be over. My parents are still gone." Lawson offered a sympathetic sigh. "We'll do everything in our power to figure out exactly what happened to them. One step at a time. The important thing is you're safe and Richard is facing justice." In the following days, news broke of Richard Vance's arrest. Headlines blazed with allegations of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Journalists hounded Chris for statements, but he and Lawson kept a low profile, releasing only minimal comment. The public was astonished to learn that a wealthy philanthropist had been orchestrating so much darkness behind the scenes. Chris watched the coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. This was the man who had stolen everything from him. At least the world now saw his true face. Richard was held without bail, awaiting trial. The prosecutors, thrilled with the mountain of evidence from the estate, lined up charges that could put him away for life. Chris gave a formal deposition, detailing what he remembered of the push, the suspicious circumstances of his parents' disappearance, and the financial irregularities discovered. It was draining, reliving those traumas, but necessary. Meanwhile, Detective Lawson worked tirelessly on the case, sifting through every ledger to uncover more co-conspirators. The diaries Chris's father had left hinted that some city officials might have aided Richard in covering up the parents' disappearance. Those investigations continued, and arrests of minor players followed. With Richard behind bars, Chris finally felt he could return to the estate, not as a fugitive or intruder, but as the rightful owner. The place remained under partial lockdown while investigators swept it, but Chris was allowed to claim personal belongings and restore some semblance of normalcy. He limped through the grand halls, still nursing old injuries, feeling a pang of grief at each memory of his parents. They were gone, and no justice would bring them back. But at least the man responsible would face legal consequences. He turned one of the smaller rooms into a quiet study, spreading out the diaries and notes, piecing together the story of how his father had grown suspicious of Richard's deals and tried to protect the family fortune. There were heartbreakingly tender lines from his mother, who seemed torn between confronting Richard and wanting to shield Chris from turmoil. Though they never explained exactly how the disappearance took place, it was clear they feared for their lives in those final days. Tears slipped down Chris's face as he read. He wished he could have told them how brave they were, how he would see this fight through to the end. While Chris was sifting through these old papers one afternoon, Detective Lawson appeared at the doorway. "You settling in?" he asked softly. Chris nodded. "Trying to. It's strange being back here without them." He glanced at Lawson. "Thank you for everything." Lawson gave him a half-smile. "I was just doing my job. But I won't lie, I became personally invested. You reminded me of why I became a detective in the first place. To protect people who can't protect themselves, to seek the truth. Maybe it's naive, but I still believe in that." Chris rose, crossing the room with a slight limp. "I believe in it too. This place, it's not the same. But at least it's not under Richard's thumb anymore." They shared a moment of contemplative silence, aware that a criminal trial still loomed. Chris would be called to testify. So would former employees who had found the courage to come forward after hearing of Richard's arrest. The entire scandal could take months, maybe years, to unravel fully. But for now there was hope. Lawson's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. They're transferring your uncle to a more secure facility. The official charges are piling up: embezzlement, conspiracy, attempted murder of you, and possibly involvement in your parents' disappearance. The attorneys want to cut a deal, apparently. Maybe he'll name names. Chris sniffed, trying not to let bitterness consume him. He can rot there for all I care, but if he can help bring me closure about my parents, I'd accept that trade. Outside, clouds shifted, allowing a warm beam of sunlight to spill through the windows. Chris and Lawson stepped out onto a balcony overlooking the estate's gardens. Once, Chris had run around those lawns with an exuberance only a child knows. He rested his hands on the railing. "It feels like years since I was that kid carefree," he said softly. "Now everything's changed. But I guess that's part of life. Growing up, facing what's real, even if it's ugly." Lawson nodded. "Sometimes the hardest truths lead to the greatest growth. You've shown a lot of courage." Chris managed a shaky smile. "I couldn't have done it alone. You saved me. And now, well, I'd like to think we're friends for life." Lawson returned the smile. "That's an honor I don't take lightly, Chris. When this is all over, maybe we can grab a coffee and talk about something besides conspiracies." The trial date was set for several months later. In the interim, Chris dedicated himself to restoring parts of the estate, making it feel less like a fortress of secret. He hired staff who had no ties to Richard, ensuring they could be trusted. He also followed through on physical therapy, determined to lose the limp that reminded him of the push. Each day he felt a bit stronger. Sometimes, neighbors or old acquaintances would stop by, offering condolences and shock at the revelations about Richard. Chris accepted them politely, though he found their pitying expressions difficult to endure. To keep himself grounded, he spent hours in the library, reading up on law and estate management. He wanted to protect his family's legacy properly this time. Some nights, he dreamed of his parents, their faces blurring with sorrow and pride as they saw him fighting to do the right thing. He'd wake up with tears on his cheeks, but also with a sense of solace that he was carrying on their memory. News outlets continued to cover the story of Richard's arrest. Public sentiment turned against him quickly, especially as more victims of his fraudulent schemes came forward. People were horrified to learn that he had nearly killed his own nephew to secure power and maintain a criminal empire. Each new tidbit hammered the final nails into his reputation. Chris watched from a distance, feeling no triumph, only a strange emptiness. Revenge hadn't been his goal, only justice. Yet he also couldn't deny a grim satisfaction that no other family would fall prey to Richard's manipulations. At long last, the day arrived when Chris Parker sat in a courtroom, wearing a neat suit, his nerves twisting. He watched from the witness stand as prosecutors laid out the evidence. The diaries from the safe, the notebook from the hidden drawer, the statements from staff members like Helen, the financial records, and testimonies from Detective Lawson. The spectators were riveted by the story of how Chris had awakened from a coma with only partial memories, then fought to uncover the truth about his parents and bring Richard to justice. When Chris took the stand, he described his recollections of the night he fell, how he felt a shove from behind, how he caught a glimpse of Richard's face twisted in anger. He recounted his hospital ordeal, the fear of being silenced, and the subsequent infiltration of the estate to retrieve his father's notes. More than once, his voice cracked, and the judge allowed brief pauses for him to compose himself. The defense tried to poke holes in his testimony, implying his memories were compromised by trauma. But the overwhelming evidence from the diaries and other witnesses undercut those claims. When the jury saw images of the secret ledgers and heard accounts of hush money, their expressions hardened. Richard himself sat at the defendant's table, shackled, looking a shadow of the confident man he once was. Occasionally, he'd glare at Chris. But for the most part, he remained silent, letting his lawyers do the speaking. Not once did he offer an apology or show remorse. His only real attempt at defense was to claim that Chris's father had initiated shady deals and that he, Richard, was trying to clean up the mess. But the diaries painted a different picture, one of blackmail, sabotage, and greed on Richard's part. The trial spanned weeks, culminating in dramatic closing arguments. Then, after deliberating, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on multiple counts: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and attempted murder of Chris Parker. They couldn't conclusively link him to the disappearance of Chris's parents without direct physical evidence, but the judge made it clear the investigation into that remained open. Chris left the courthouse with tears in his eyes, clinging to Lawson's supportive handshake. In the aftermath, Richard Vance faced a lengthy prison sentence, and Chris was free to pick up the pieces of his life. He still longed for clarity about his parents' fate, but the knowledge that their killer, or at least the one who orchestrated their downfall, was behind bars provided some measure of closure. The estate stood as a reminder of all he had lost and all he had gained. He walked its corridors more confidently now, forging new memories to replace the old nightmares. From time to time, Detective Lawson dropped by, offering a listening ear or simply sharing a meal in the grand dining room that had once played host to such secrecy. "We did good," Lawson would say, nursing a cup of coffee by the fireplace. "The city sees you as a hero, you know." Chris would shake his head. "Not a hero. Just someone who refused to stay silent." They would laugh about small things, the intensity of their bond forged in the crucible of near tragedy. And so, life began to move forward. Chris initiated repairs to parts of the estate that had fallen into disuse. He considered opening a portion of it to public events or charitable functions, hoping to dispel the shadow Richard had cast over the Parker name. The pain of his parents' disappearance lingered, but with each day it dulled a bit, replaced by the determination to honor their memory through deeds that upheld the values they cherished: honesty, compassion, and courage. On a crisp afternoon, Chris found himself standing at the top of the grand staircase, gazing down at the very steps where he had nearly died. The house was quiet, sunlight streaming through the stained glass window. His reflection on the polished banister was no longer the frightened boy, but a man who had battled darkness and emerged with scars that only strengthened his resolve. He placed a hand on the railing, remembering the abruptness of the push, the terror of that moment. Then he exhaled, letting the memory wash away. As he descended the steps, Detective Lawson appeared at the bottom, having just let himself in. "Am I interrupting?" Lawson asked gently. Chris shook his head. "Just revisiting old ghosts." They met in the foyer, sharing a look of mutual respect and friendship. Lawson cleared his throat. "I got word from the state corrections office. Richard is, well, let's just say he's having a hard time behind bars, but he's alive. There's still a chance he might talk about your parents if he thinks it'll reduce his sentence." Chris's jaw tightened. "He never gives up scheming, does he?" Lawson shrugged. "True. But if he reveals something that helps us find them, alive or not, it might bring more closure." Chris nodded, staring at the crest on the floor that bore his family name. "I suppose we'll cross that bridge if it comes. For now, I'm just grateful to be free to keep living." Lawson clapped him on the shoulder. "You deserve it. After everything, I'd say you more than earned a life unshackled by secrets." They headed into the study for coffee, the aroma filling the once somber room. Chris asked, "Think we'll ever solve the entire puzzle? Or figure out if he had bigger players behind him?" Lawson considered. "We're still pursuing leads. Some of those diaries mention officials we haven't pinned down yet. But we made the biggest dent by putting Richard away. The rest is follow-up." Chris listened, swirling sugar into his cup. "I'll help however I can. My father wanted these conspiracies exposed." Lawson gave a small nod of agreement. "I'll keep you in the loop." Outside, late afternoon sunshine bathed the gardens. Chris felt a sense of renewal, as though each blossom, each stirring leaf, symbolized the future he could build out of the ruins. After a while, Lawson took his leave, promising to return soon. Chris stood at the threshold, watching his friend walk to the car. Two men from very different backgrounds, bound by the events that had threatened both their lives. An unlikely partnership that blossomed into a genuine friendship. In the quiet that followed, Chris remembered a moment from the hospital, the day he first woke, how he had felt so alone, so unheard. Now, he was anything but alone. With Richard gone, the staff and acquaintances who were loyal to the Parker family had started reaching out, some even returning to help maintain the property. He was forging new connections, turning the estate into a place of warmth instead of fear. At times, he caught glimpses of his reflection in mirrors, recalling how fragile he had once been after the coma. The transformation was stark. He was no longer simply surviving, he was living. That night, he walked through the corridors with a calm heart. The hush of the house felt different, no longer menacing. He paused in front of an old portrait of his parents, gently brushing off the dust. "I did it," he whispered to their painted faces. "I made sure he can't hurt anyone else." In his mind, he imagined them smiling, proud that their son had uncovered the truth. Perhaps the path to justice was incomplete, and perhaps part of him would always yearn for their embrace. But the darkness that once shrouded his inheritance had been lifted. Word by word, day by day, he continued unraveling more of the Parker family mysteries. The diaries left behind numerous threads to chase, from real estate deals overseas to questionable alliances within local politics. Still, the triumph over Richard Vance stood as a testament to his and Lawson's resolve. No longer was he a helpless coma patient. He had taken back his life, and even though scars remained, physical and emotional, they reminded him that he was strong enough to face whatever future challenges might arise. Eventually, news came that the official owners of the safe house had returned, and Chris smiled when he realized how far he had come since those nerve-wracking days in hiding. He visited the old place with Lawson, reminiscing about the fear that had consumed him then. It felt like a lifetime ago. "If I'd known everything that was ahead, I don't think I would have believed I could handle it," Chris admitted. Lawson chuckled. "Sometimes ignorance is bliss. But you handled it better than most." Even as they parted ways that afternoon, with Lawson heading back to the station and Chris to his estate, a sense of finality and new beginnings lingered in the air. Chris felt at peace for the first time in years. Soon, Richard Vance would be formally sentenced, and the estate would be fully his to command. He pondered setting up a charitable foundation in his parents' honor, focusing on helping victims of fraud and violence, those who found themselves powerless in the face of hidden conspiracies. It would be a fitting tribute to them and to his own journey. One evening, a package arrived, no return address. Inside was a small locket that belonged to his mother, something Chris hadn't seen since he was a child. Alongside it was a note typed in block letters. "They would be proud of you." Chris stared at it, heart pounding. Who had sent it? A survivor from Richard's circle? An ally who had once served the Parker family? He had no way to know. But the message filled him with a gentle warmth. He clasped the locket, tears in his eyes, and smiled up at the ceiling as though his parents might be watching. In time, as the city's headlines drifted to other news, Chris found solace in the normalcy of a life free from immediate danger. He hired staff to help run the estate, not as a fortress but as a place for philanthropic endeavors. Detective Lawson became a regular visitor, each time greeted warmly by the new employees who recognized him as the man who helped restore justice. They would sit in the parlor or stroll the gardens, sharing stories about small victories in the city's ongoing fight against corruption. Some nights, they would have dinner and laugh about something trivial, cherishing the simplicity of peaceful companionship. Chris also reconnected with old friends who had scattered once his uncle took over. One of them, a childhood confidant named Melanie, confided how she had always suspected something was off about the way Richard swept in after Chris's parents disappeared. "I didn't know how to reach you," she said apologetically. Chris forgave her easily, understanding that everyone had been manipulated by Richard's facade. Their conversation wound into the night, talking about the estate as it once was and as it could be again. By the time she left, Chris felt a renewed sense of belonging. He was piecing together not only the Parker legacy but also the social tapestry that had been ripped apart by betrayal. Eventually, Richard's sentencing day arrived. Chris opted to attend, standing in the back of the courtroom as the judge delivered a stern condemnation of Richard's crimes. The final sentence was decades in a maximum security facility, with no possibility of parole for at least 20 years. Richard stood there, hollow-eyed, offering no apology. Chris watched him, heartsore but resolute. As the gavel struck, he felt a sense of closure. Outside, Lawson found him on the courthouse step. "You did it," Lawson said gently. Chris nodded, voice thick with emotion. "We did it." That night, back at the estate, Chris walked through the grand foyer alone, recalling the swirl of chaos it had once hosted. Now, it was silent, the only sound his steady footsteps on the marble. He passed by the foot of the staircase, where he could still picture his broken body lying weeks ago, no, months ago, before everything changed. He took a seat on the bottom step, letting out a deep breath. The house seemed to breathe with him, as though it, too, had emerged from a suffocating weight. He saw the distant reflection of lightning in the window, reminiscent of the stormy night when Richard had threatened him at gunpoint. Yet the memory no longer paralyzed him. He felt grateful to be alive, to have reclaimed this space. He retrieved his mother's locket from his pocket, pressing it against his palm. "I don't know if you're out there, Mom, Dad," he whispered. "But if you are, this is for you. I'll keep the place alive, keep our name free from scandal. I promise." His words echoed softly off the walls, and though there was no verbal reply, he felt a quiet warmth settle within him. Slowly, Chris climbed the staircase, each step deliberate, each one an echo of the resilience that had propelled him through every obstacle. He reached the top and paused, gazing back over the foyer as if surveying an entire era of his life. Gone were the illusions of a safe, sheltered upbringing, replaced by an adult's hard-earned perspective on betrayal and courage. Yet the future felt open, vibrant with possibility. Smiling softly to himself, he turned and walked toward his bedroom, where fresh sheets and the promise of a peaceful night's rest awaited him. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.